Maseches Yevamos Daf Yud Dalid focuses on the concept of a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The Gemara wants to know when there is a machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and we know that the halacha is like Beis Hillel. There was a baskol, was a voice that echoed from heaven and said that the halacha is always like Beis Hillel. The question is, did Beis Shammai keep their own halacha, or did Beis Shammai conform to Beis Hillel psak, even though they disagreed with it fundamentally? The Gemara is going to explore the question of did Beis Shammai follow their own psak or not. The Gemara is going to try to provide a number of proofs on the question one way or another. So, first of all, the Gemara says it's a machlokes Amoraim. It's Rav and Rish Lakish who say that Beis Shammai did not keep their own psak. Beis Shammai followed the psak of Beis Hillel because that was the halacha. It's against Rav Yochanan and Shmuel who say that Beis Shammai did follow their own psak. So the Gemara first of all has to understand what is this machlokes about. When did this machlokes come about? Are we discussing what happened before the voice came out of Shemayim and Paskin like Beis Hillel, or are we talking afterwards? Either way it makes no sense, because if it's before, why shouldn't Beis Shammai keep their own psak? What would be the reasoning of the one who said that they did not? And if it's afterwards, so then how could Beis Shammai keep their own psak? What is the reasoning of the opinion that says that they did keep their own psak if a voice out of Shemayim specifically said not to do that? So the Gemara says I can understand it either way. I can understand that it's discussing before the voice came out of Shemayim, before there was a baskol passing like Beis Hillel, and the machlokes says as follows: Beis Hillel was the majority, and therefore, generally, the terms of the principles of psak should be that you follow the majority. However, Beis Shammai was more mechaded, they were sharper, they were smarter, they were sharper, however you want to define that. And therefore, it's possible that in a case like that, you don't follow the majority. Now, the Gemara therefore says that's the machlokes. Did Beis Shammai follow their own ruling because they considered that the majority here doesn't win because they were sharper? Or did they follow Beis Hillel's psak because Beis Hillel were the majority? Now, I could also understand that this machlokes is talking about after the baskol, after the voice. What would be the argument then? So the question would be, do you paskin a halacha based on a baskol? According to the one who says that Beis Shammai followed Beis Hillel's psak because the baskol said, so they followed the ruling of the baskol. The other one would be the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, who we saw in Maseches Bava Metzia, where there were many signs in Shemayim that the halacha was like Rabbi Elazar, and he refused to follow the psak anyway, and he said, we don't paskin based on a baskol, we paskin based on the rules of psak here in this world. And therefore Beis Shammai would say, we follow our own rules, and we're going to follow our own psak, irrelevant, we're not impressed with what this baskol says. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to know, why is this not a problem of lo tisgodedu? According to the opinion that they follow their own psak, you have two different Torahs in Klal Yisrael. Beis Hillel has their set of rules, and Beis Shammai has their set of rules. There should be a violation of the Yisrael lo tisgodedu, which says do not make Klal Yisrael into different groups. So the Gemara is going to discuss three levels of division. We could have the lowest level of division would be that if different different groups, different sets of chachamim in different cities keep different halachos, that would be the less divisive. Different towns have different halachas. Okay, not such a big deal. Or you could have a situation that even within one town, different but they didn't paskin indifferently. And that would be the middle level. And the highest level of divisiveness would be if within one beis din itself, you have some chachamim paskening one way and some chachamim paskening the other way. So the Gemara first wants to say that the differences between level 2 and level 3. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are in different towns, and therefore they are allowed to paskin differently. It's not considered divisive. Lo tisgodedu only asks the higher level where you have different but they did within the same town that are paskening divisively with different rulings. So the Gemara says that can't be correct, because Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai had many people who lived within the same town, and therefore you would have different people within the same town paskening differently and different but they didn't. So you cannot say that they followed their own halacha if that's what the Isser of lo tisgodedu applies to. So the Gemara says we have to shift it all up one level. The Isser only applies to different chachamim within the same beis din, the highest level of divisiveness. However, one level below that, where you have different but they didn't within the same town, paskening differently, that's okay, and that's what happened between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and that's why it was not a problem of lo tisgodedu. Okay. Now the Gemara wants to start bringing proofs. Did Beis Shammai follow the ruling, or did they follow the ruling of Beis Hillel? So the Gemara goes to a different machlokes between other chachamim, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Two different halachas, not arguing against each other. You have Rabbi Eliezer against the chachamim and Rabbi Yossi Haglili against the chachamim. So Rabbi Eliezer was singled out in his understanding that you're allowed to do malachos on Shabbos if they are preparing for a bris milah. that the bris itself you're allowed to do on Shabbos, even though it's an Isser, even though it would seem to violate the halachos of Shabbos because you're cutting skin and making a wound, drawing blood. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos. That's clear. That we learn from Sukkim. The question is, can you prepare for the bris on Shabbos? So Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, you can. And you're allowed to do things which are distant from the actual bris and which you could have done before Shabbos. So you're even allowed to cut down trees in order to build a fire to make charcoal so that you can smelt the knife and make the knife in order to be able to do the actual bris itself. You're allowed to do all that on Shabbos. Anything which is in the process towards making a bris happen, you're allowed to do on Shabbos. So Chavim disagreed. The Raisa that says in Rabbi Eliezer's town, they would do that. They would chop down trees on Shabbos if it was ultimately going to lead to a bris that they planned to make. Now, Rabbi Yossi Haglili also has a opinion in which he's set apart from the rest of the Chachamim. That is, he holds that you're allowed to eat chicken and milk. The Torah only asers beef, animals, not birds, animals to be cooked with milk. Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds it's permitted to have chicken and milk. He holds it's not even an Isser Derabanan. The Chacham did not hold that way. This Brisa says that in his town they paskin that ruling. So it says here you have two Chachamim that followed their own psak in their own town, but it's clear that in other places they followed the other psakim. So for example, in Rabbi Kiva's town they did not go like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Kiva held that you're not allowed to cut anything, you're not allowed to do any malacha for bris on Shabbos if you could have done it before Shabbos. So therefore, we see that it was divided up town by town, and this should be a proof that Beis Shammai did keep their own halacha, and we should also consider lotus go to do. So the Gemara says it's not a problem of lotus go to do here, like we said before. This is in different towns. Different towns is not lotus go to do. Lotus go to do is only within the same town. The Gemara says, well, yeah, that's an obvious answer. The one who asked this kasha, what was he asking? The Gemara says he thought that because it's talking about Hilchos Shabbos, which is punishable by skila, we should be extra strict and say you have to have the same halacha in all towns. He thought that would be considered to be divisive even if they were in separate towns, and the answer is no. Even strict halachos like Shabbos, in different towns you're allowed to have different psakim. Now the Gemara has another proof. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yavo would keep different halachos depending where he was about moving a candle on Shabbos. Did he consider it to be muktzah or not? Now that's a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Huda. And when he was in the town of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, he would move muktzah. When he was in the town of Rabbi Yochanan, he would not move this candle in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Huda. So Gemara says, same thing, different towns, different psakim. What's your kasha? The Gemara says, no, the kasha is on Rabbi Yavo. How could he do differently in different towns? He should keep one halacha wherever he is. So the Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. He held that the halacha was that it's mutter. He held like Rabbi Shimon, and he held like Rabbi Shua ben Levi. When he was in Rabbi Yochanan's town, out of deference and covet to Rabbi Yochanan, he was strict and withheld from doing something which he held was permitted. Nothing wrong with doing that. And therefore, he did not move a candle that was burning at that time in accordance with the local psak. Now, the Gemara says, what about his attendant? He probably saw him moving muktzah in other places, and he would have moved it even in Rabbi Yochanan's town, and therefore, where's the covet? The Gemara says, no, he warns his attendant that here in this town, we follow the halachos of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore, we're not going to move a candle on Shabbos. All right, now the Gemara is going to go to more direct proofs of the machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Did Beis Shammai keep their own halacha or not? So the one that we're primarily discussing is the halacha of a tzaras erva. We know that Beis Hillel holds that a tzaras erva is freed from yibum and she's forbidden to do yibum. Beis Shammai says she's not freed from yibum, she's obligated to do yibum. Now this is a major difference here because both of them would hold that the other one is doing an isser. According to Beis Shammai, the tzaras erva is an eishes ach. She's forbidden. She's an erva to the brother. If she marries the brother, she's chayiv kares, and her kids are mamzerim. According to Beis Shammai, she's obligated to do that unless she gets chalitza. The kids are not mamzerim. She's not chayiv kares at all. According to Beis Shammai, if the tzaras erva would go marry somebody else, some random person from the street, without chalitza, she would be violating a lav of a tzara who is not doing yibum or chalitza like she is supposed to. According to Beis Hillel, she would be doing what she's supposed to do. She's free from any obligation, so she's fine. But if she were to do that, Beis Shammai would say she violates an isser lav. Now, generally, lav does not carry any major repercussions for the kids. The kids are ksherim. There is no isser. It's not as severe an isser the other way. So we need to keep in mind, according to Beis Shammai, somebody who paskins like Beis Hillel is violating a lav, but the children are okay, they're not mamzer. According to Beis Hillel, though, somebody passing like Beis Shammai is violating an Isser Kores, and the children would be mamzerim. So the Gemara refers back to our Mishnah, where we had said that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did not stop each other. They did not refuse to marry into each other's families. Even though, according to Beis Shammai, people who follow the Pesach of Beis Hillel may be mamzerim. If you had a Yevama who was the opposite, according to Beis Hillel, somebody followed the Pesach of Beis Shammai, so you had a Yevama who was doing Yibum when she was not in the mitzvah Yibum. You had a Tsaras Erva who was doing Yibum, which was an Isser Eshes Ach. Beis Hillel would say that was an Isser Karis, and the kids are mamzerim. Still, they married into each other's families. So the Gemara says, how is this possible? Well, there's a possibility of marrying mamzerim, which is a terrible Isser. Now, I understand how Beis Shammai could marry Beis Hillel's family, because at worst, they violated an Isser Lav, and the kids are not mamzerim. But how could Beis Hillel people marry into Beis Shammai's family? There might be mamzerim running around in that family. So that must prove, the Gemara says, that Beis Shammai did not follow their own psak. Instead, they went like Beis Hillel, and they did not allow a Tzaras Erva to do Yibum. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. It could just be that simply they warned them. The people of Beis Shammai warned Beis Hillel and their followers about any shidduch that they intended to do, whether or not there was mamzerim, according to Beis Hillel's opinion, in their family, if there was any Tzaras Erva who did Yibum in this family here. And therefore they would not marry those individuals or their descendants. Now, the Gemara says, I'll bring you a proof that this is true, because the rest of the Mishnah says that even though they had different halachas as far as taharos, Beis Shammai held that some things that Beis Hillel considered to be tamei were really tahar, and therefore, how could Beis Hillel use Beis Shammai's kelim? According to Beis Shammai, they were tahar. According to Beis Hillel, what Beis Shammai considered to be tahar would be tamei. And yet the Mishnah says they did not stop from using each other's kelim; they used it fine. It must be that they would let them know if the kli that they wanted to borrow was a kli that was tamei. According to Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai would let them know that is so, and therefore that proves that they would let them know. So the Gemara says, what kind of proof is this? You're telling me the same thing. You're telling me that they would let them know. Why is it more logical that has to be in the case of the kelim and the tumah than in the case of them marrying the tzara? You're giving me the same answer. You're not proving it. So Gemara says, no, it is a proof because you could have gotten away with it in the case of the tzara. The case of the tzara, you could say they didn't let them know. It's not that they advised them if there was an isser tzara or mamzer here, but the concept of a tzaras erva, getting married, is something which would be well known. It's something that people talk about. So it's possible that although Beis Shammai did not inform Beis Hillel and warn them if there was an issue here that they would potentially be encountering according to their opinion, still they knew about it anyway. And they relied that they would find out about it because it's a thing that people talk about and becomes famous. However, that this kli had tumah on it, they wouldn't know. And therefore, maybe Beis Hillel would refuse to use those kelim. The fact that they didn't must be that they were informed and they warned them when such a situation arose. Now, the Gemara considers another possibility. Maybe you'll tell me that no, they didn't warn them. But Beis Hillel was not afraid that even though they married into Beis Shammai's family, they would be encountering a mamzer. And that's because they agreed that they held that the child of an Isser Kares would not be mamzer. They held that the child of an Isser Kares is not mamzer. The only time you have an Isser mamzer is if you have a child that's descending from a marriage which was an Isser misas vezdin, such as a marriage to a parent's relative. But a marriage to a sibling's relative, which doesn't carry misas vezdin, it only carries kares, that would not create mamzerim, and that's where Beis Hillel was not concerned, because there would be no mamzeros in many of these cases. There's the case here of the tzaros erva who does ibam, the issa that she's violating is out of Eishes Ach. Eishes Ach doesn't carry Mrs. Bezdin, and therefore maybe Beis Hillel held that it's not making mamzer. Whereas that's not true, because we have a brisa that says that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agreed to each other, even though they argued this, the halacha of tzaras erva, they agreed to each other that the only thing that makes, this is the exact phraseology, the only thing that makes mamzerim is when you have an Isser Erva and a punishment of kares. So you see clearly there that Beis Hillel did hold that kares did make mamzerim, so you can't use that as an answer. Now the Gemara wants to understand this brisa a little bit more in depth of here. What do you mean Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agreed that the only time you have an Isser Kares, the only time mamzerim are created is when there's an Isser Kares? That sounds like in this case of tzaras erva, somebody's agreeing that there's no kares. Who's agreeing to who? Well, somebody's agreeing to who, that is, that there's no mamzerim. So who's agreeing to who that there's no mamzerim? Either Beis Shammai is agreeing to Beis Hillel, or Beis Hillel is agreeing to Beis Shammai. So let's work this out one at a time. If you tell me Beis Shammai is agreeing to Beis Hillel that there's no karei, that there's no mamzerim, that's not a chiddush. The worst that could possibly happen, according to Beis Shammai, is that a tzaras ever would go marry somebody from the street, even though she was supposed to get chalitza first, or do yibum. That's only a lav. That would never create any mamzerim, so Beis Shammai is nothing to agree to. On the other hand, you'll tell me no, it's Beis Hillel, it's agreeing to Beis Shammai, that even though a tzaras ever does yibum, it's not going to create mamzerim. Well, that's not true. You just told me that they agree that any isur kares makes mamzerim, so that means they're not agreeing. So what do you mean that they agreed? So Gemara says, what it means to say is that Beis Shammai agreed that it's not mamzerus, which Rabbi Akiva, who originally learned from Beis Shammai, was Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer, who was a Talmud of Shammai. Later he switched Rabbi Akiva when he left Rabbi Eliezer and went to Beis Hillel. But Beis Shammai does not hold, like Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that there are mamzerim from a chayvei lavan. Even though the tzara, marrying somebody from the street, is a lav, and Rabbi Akiva would say that those descendants are mamzerim, we do not hold that way, and Beis Shammai agreed to Beis Hillel that they're not mamzerim. Okay, now the Gemara is going to return to the discussion about whether Beis Shammai kept their own halachas or not. The Gemara is going to try to bring another proof as to whether Beis Shammai kept their own halachas or not. So here we have a brisa that says as follows: even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue about a number of cases which could create mamzerim, and the brisa will give examples, still they did not desist from marrying into each other's families. The expression that's used here is Beis Shammai did not desist from marrying Beis Hillel's family, and Beis Hillel did not resist from marrying into Beis Shammai's family. The Brisa finishes off by saying, this is to teach you that there was love and friendship between them, and that's in order to fulfill the pasuk which says, truth and peace they loved. Now, in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon says, they did resist from marrying cases where there was a vadai mamzer. They only resisted from marrying a case where there's a suffix mamzer. So, why would they resist from marrying a case where there's a vadai mamzer if Beis Shammai didn't keep their own halachos? What is Beis Shammai afraid of? They didn't keep their own halachos, they kept Beis Hillel's halachos. Obviously, that proves that Beis Shammai did keep their own halachos. So before we get to the answer, let's see the examples that the Brisa brought, which I skipped over. The cases where you have a machlokes as to whether or not there are kids that are mamzer. So the Brisas, the examples are as follows. There's the case of tzaros, that's our discussion, where we have a tzaras erva that's doing yibum. According to Beis Hillel, that's mamzerus. It's an eser shazach. According to Beis Shammai, that's required. You have the case of achayos, simply the sisters. That's a case which we'll get to later in the Avchavav, where you have 4 brothers. 2 of them are married to 2 sisters. Those 2 brothers die. The 2 sisters then fall to even to the 2 brothers. There's machlokes whether or not they're allowed to do yibum, and if they do yibum, what is the halacha of that marriage? Next, you have the case of the get yashon. That is a person who gives his wife a get and then is secluded with her. Do we have to assume that they were together l'shem kiddushin and therefore they are married now? If they are married, then somebody else who comes and tries to marry this woman would not be married to him. And if somebody else is together with her, that would be a mamzer that's produced from them. If, however, they were not, we do not assume they were together. She's not married and she would be married to the second person. Of course, it would switch if somebody tried to marry her again afterwards, after the first marriage was dissolved. So you could have both ways. There could be mamzerim according to one opinion and not according to the other opinion, depending on what happened. Then you have the case of suffix ishes dish, a question of whether a woman's married or not. There could be a number of cases that fit into that. Rashi brings the case of a ketana, a child who was married off to a man by her mother or brother because her father was not around and did not have rights in her marriage any longer. That's always a suffix marriage because she could walk out at any time. Next thing in the Raisa is the case of somebody who divorces his wife and then spends a night with her in a hotel, very similar to the case of Get Yashon. And then you have the case of somebody who marries a woman and does Kiddushin with something that is valuable enough according to Beis Hillel, but not valuable enough according to Beis Shammai. According to Beis Hillel, all you need to do a Kiddushin is a pruta worth. According to Beis Shammai, you need a dinar worth. So if somebody used in between, according to Beis Hillel, they're married. According to Beis Shammai, they're not married. If then this woman goes and accepts Kiddushin from somebody else, or is together with somebody else, according to Beis Hillel, that kid's a mamzer. According to Beis Shammai, it's not. If she's then divorced from the first one, according to Beis Hillel, she's not married to the second one either. According to Beis Shammai, she is, and if she's together with somebody else, then that kid would be a mamzer. So all these cases are cases where you have arguments as to whether they're mamzerim or not, but still, like we said, they did not resist. Rav Shimon says they did resist from marrying into each other if there was a case of a vadai. So that obviously proves that they did follow their own halachos. So Gemara says it doesn't make sense. Says the Gemara, you cannot possibly understand this price the way it's written in any way. Because if you understand it simply that it means to say that they withheld from marrying into each other's families, so then I understand why Beis Hillel would withdraw from marrying into Beis Shammai's family, because Beis Shammai people, according to Beis Hillel, have mamzerim there. You had a tzaras erva marrying an Eishes Ach. However, why would Beis Shammai withhold from marrying into Beis Hillel's families? At worst, the tzaras erva case is just a person who's chayav in yibum, who goes and marries somebody in the street. That's just a lav and zil mamzerim. So what's the problem here? So the Gemara says, obviously it must mean something else. It must mean that they did not withhold from keeping the others' halachos. And that's to say that Beis Shammai did keep Beis Hillel's halacha, and they also considered it to be forbidden to marry the tzaras erva to yibum, and instead to allow her to marry to the street. So they did withhold from being lenient in their own way, and they did keep to Beis Hillel's halacha. And therefore there's no proof to what you want to say that they kept to their own halacha, instead they kept to Beis Hillel's halacha, and that's what's meant by they did not withhold. So Gemara says, if that's what it means, then what does it mean that they did not withhold from a suffix, only from a vadai? What's the difference between a suffix and a vadai? They didn't want to do a vadai iser, so they also should not want to do a suffix iser. If they have a suffix tzaras erva, they wouldn't want to do that either. It's a suffix doing an iser. Now, up till now, we didn't have a problem with that, because we meant a case where somebody had a suffix if something was usher according to the other one's opinion. That means that they weren't sure, they had a woman, they weren't sure if they were mamzerim according to let's say Beis Hillel had a case where there was someone who may have been a case of a mamzer according to Beis Shammai's approach. So that's really a suffix who the halacha is like, and suffix if this woman is in that actual circumstance. So there I would understand. The suffix in the case of a suffix, so they were mekel, and they didn't withhold from marrying them. Only a vadai case that depended on this machlokes did they withhold. But now that we're saying that they didn't withhold, means they didn't withhold from the actual person herself, the actual tzara herself, who's related to this question. So that's just a regular suffix. Why would they do a suffix iser if they didn't want to do a vadai iser? So the Gemara says, so suffix here doesn't mean suffix. Suffix means stam. It means where they had a woman and did not know whether she was a tzaras erva or not. So if they knew she was tzaras erva, then they followed the other halacha. If they knew she wasn't, there was no problem. If they didn't know, so there they would marry her. They would assume that she wasn't. They would say, because if she would have been somebody that I would hold was usher, then the other one would certainly advise me of that fact. So says the Gemara, so then what's the significance of quoting Rabbi Shimon? All Rabbi Shimon means to say is that they assumed that they would be told if a certain perspective shidduch was usher to them, according to their opinion. So all you're pretty much saying is that they respected each other. So the Brisa itself says that they respected each other. What do you have to add? What's Rabbi Shimon adding? The Brisa says that the Brisa just means to say that the entire Brisa is all Rabbi Shimon speaking, and it's all one flow. They didn't withhold from marrying into each other, especially in a case where they didn't know if it was usher or not. They would be notified if it wasn't, because they treated each other with love and respect. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to another proof as to whether Beis Shammai kept its own halachos or the halachos of Beis Hillel. So Gemara here quotes a brisa, quotes a statement of Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, a brisa, Tosefta. Rav Yochanan ben Nuri says, what should we do halachically in the case of a tzaras erva? Beis Shammai says she's chayav in yibum. Beis Hillel says she's usher to do yibum. So what should we do? What should we paskin for Klal Yisrael? If we keep one halacha, we're going to end up with mamzerim. If we keep the other halacha, we're going to end up with an iser yevamos Daf. So instead, let's make the rule that they have to always do chalitza, and that way we'll avoid the problem altogether. Says the Brisa, they did not get a chance to actually set up this takana in Klal Yisrael until something happened, and they weren't able to. Time was taken away from them, the Brisa says. Now, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel comments on that, and he says, if we were to do that and make them all obligated to do chalitza, what would we do with the people who did the tzaros in the past, the tzaros ervo that happened already, what we do for them. So the Gemara assumes that this means the tzaros ervos that already did yibum, and according to Beis Hillel, their kids are mamzerim, and that's going to become widespread by publicizing the psak that everybody needs to do chalitza now. How are we going to help them? Because that clearly shows that there were women who followed Beis Shammai's psak, because Beis Shammai must have followed their own psak, and you had people who did yibum, even though they were tzaras erva, and Beis Hillel held that was an iser kares. Whereas no, it's not necessarily what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean that what are we going to do about the people who followed Beis Shammai's psak now that we're taking a parav stance. What the Gemara means is, what the Brisa means, or Shimon and Gamliel means, is what we do with the people who followed Beis Hillel's psak. That is, you had the women followed the halacha of Beis Hillel, they were tzaros, and they went and they married somebody else from the street without doing chalitza first. Now, according to what we want to set up that will avoid our problems by insisting that everybody get chalitza, those women didn't have chalitza. What are we going to do for them? Now, don't tell me that they should go get chalitza now, because they're married to somebody. If they go get chalitza from someone else, it's going to create a rift between her and her husband, and we have a rule, we want to keep things smooth and calm and friendly between husband and wife. We do not want to have a rift created between people, and that's what he was asking. And therefore, it's really, the question is about people who followed Beis Hillel's psak, not people who followed Beis Shammai's psak, because possibly Beis Shammai never followed their own psak.